Christmas is only 5 days away. For the 6 of you that are excited about that, it's going to be a great time. Hey, 2020 is almost over. Hey, yeah. Hey, no, it is almost Christmas, and we've been talking all month, if you haven't had a chance to be with us, we've been talking all month about the idea of a simple Christmas or simply Christmas. And way beyond, I mean, it makes sense because of, COVID and everything else and kind of keeping things simple and all of that. But way beyond all of that, the simple Christmas, or really the idea we've talked about is when you allow things to get simple, it's easier to see the meaning. It's easier to see the importance of Christmas. And so hopefully over the month of December, you have started to begin to realize the significance of Christmas and what Christmas means. And if you were with us, and you know this, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that one of the things that Christmas reminds us of is just that. We have a need that we can't meet, that our sins have separated us from God, and Christmas points at that and reminds us of that. The other thing that Christmas does is it kind of surfaces a problem in some ways, and it's one we've all experienced, where we have good intentions and we want to do the right thing, and we really are wanting to be a good person and do good things, but so often our good intentions don't turn out to be real actions, and that's a problem. And so we've kind of focused on that. But today, we're actually talking about something a little more positive, that God has made you a promise. Now, I don't know if you know that or if you've ever thought about it that way, but God has specifically made you a promise. And for a lot of people, this is where Christmas breaks down, which is hard for me to understand. But for a lot of people, the Christmas kind of starts to fall apart here, because if you talk to any average person and you said, hey, you know what, the world around us, it's kind of broken. It's not the way it's supposed to be. Man, people, yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's got to be better than this, right? I mean, things should be different. Things shouldn't be the way they are. And again, if people are being honest, maybe the most arrogant person wouldn't say this, but most people would say, have you ever had good intentions and not followed through? Or have you ever intended not to do something wrong and you did it anyway? And, well, yeah, that happens all the time. But when it comes to the idea of God making them a promise, for a lot of folks, they get frustrated with that. They back away from that. And I think it's because for a lot of us, when it comes to promises, we know more about broken promises than we do about kept promises. And sometimes it's about silly things. Sometimes it's not about anything important. It could be about something as simple as buying a car. Like you figured they were promising you something and they didn't. And so recently, I came across this when I was talking about promises. Somebody that bought a car and weren't real happy with the experience. So let's put that up. Norman Chrysler Jeep Dodge lied to make this sale. So they're kind of like, you lied to us and you broke your promise. And that's bothersome, that's annoying. But then when it's a relationship and a broken promise, it's a little bit deeper, right? And if you're like me, about my age, you know that the only good music really came out of the 80s, right? I mean, that's when 90s music is too depressing. No, 80s music is happy. No, 80s music. There was a band in the 80s called Naked Eyes, and they had a song called Promises, Promises. And the chorus was, promises, promises, you knowing I'd believe. You made promises, promises, knowing you wouldn't keep them. And the whole song was about this relationship that this guy had and this girl that made him promises, and she wasn't going to keep them. In the 2020s, it's kind of gotten a little bit darker, to be honest with you. I came across a clothing line that's called Broken Promises. And they market their clothes to teenagers and young adults. And as I was kind of researching and looking at this, and I kind of wanted to find out about them a little bit, and I found on their website their message of what they're all about. And it says, we make clothes for the unseen and the unheard in a world where words mean nothing and promises are never kept. Merry Christmas, right? I mean, it's like, golly, that's brutal. That just sounds awful. But for a lot of people, when it comes to promises, that's what they know. And you know this too. When somebody close to you makes a promise about something important and they don't keep it, that stands out, doesn't it? I mean, when your parents make you a promise and they don't keep it, that hurts. When your spouse makes a promise and they don't keep their promise, I mean, that sets you back. That changes your life. But the other side of it is true too. When somebody close to you makes you a promise about something important and they keep it, that gives you confidence. That builds trust. I mean, that brings joy to your life. That becomes a story that you tell. How my husband or my wife or my kids or my friend or whatever, they promised and they kept it, and look what happened because of it. I mean, we tell that story. It actually becomes part of our story when somebody keeps a promise that matters. And so today we're going to look at a promise that God made you, and he made it through a man named Isaiah. And Isaiah lived a long time ago. And he wrote about a promise that God made. And if you've got a Bible or you want to follow along in the app, we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 9. But Isaiah lived in a world that was a mess, to be honest. I mean, everything around him was kind of falling apart. And as he writes this promise, you need to know what's happening around him. He's in a place where thousands of people have died, where the economy has completely crashed, where part of their nation has actually been invaded and taken on by somebody else. And on top of all of that, there's this constant threat of danger and violence. And out of that, Isaiah says, listen, God has a promise for you. God actually wants to say something to you. And he writes it in such an amazing way that in the middle of the mess, this promise actually changes things. And he says something else about it. He says, not only did God make you a promise, but the promise is kept and it keeps you. Which you might be going, what does that mean? And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. God's going to keep his promise, and God keeping his promise is actually what keeps you. So if you've got your Bible, I know I said Isaiah chapter 9, but we're actually going to back up just one verse into Isaiah chapter 8 to help us get started today. Because again, I want you to understand what's happening. If you read all of Isaiah 8, you would know this. Things are bad. I mean, they're really bad. There's not a lot of hope. People feel like things have gotten worse than they expected, and they've stayed that way. And that's kind of the context that Isaiah writes in Isaiah 8:22, and he says it this way. He says, then they, and he's talking about his own people, then they will look towards the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Now, we're going to kind of take these a verse at a time because there's a lot happening here. And for some of you, when you hear this, you're going to shake your head. No, I don't agree with that. And others, you're going to hear it and you're going to shake your head, yes. And a lot of you are going to go, maybe. But you have to understand how Isaiah saw the world. See, Isaiah saw the world through, I would call, a God lens. He didn't see the world the way everybody else did. So Isaiah is looking around at his world and he's saying, you know what, things are dark. And you know why they're dark? This is Isaiah. They're dark because people have moved away from God. And their sins are starting to catch up to them. That they've pushed God away for so long. They've walked away from God. They've done different than what God says. And because of that, God has allowed their sins to catch up with them. And they're beginning to realize what life looks like away from God. Now, a normal person might read this as a historian and see what's going on. And they would say, oh, no, it's not that. No, it's not that. It just so happens that this army invaded here at this time. It just so happens that this general destroyed this town. It just so happens that there was a famine at this time. It just so happens that there was disease and sickness going on. It just so happens that all those things just so happened to happen at the same time. There's all kinds of natural explanations. But for Isaiah, who saw the world through the lens of what God is doing, he said, no, it's not coincidence. It's not stuff that just happened. It's not because an emperor over here made a decision or a general over there or this or that or the weather or whatever. It's because we've moved away from God. And God has allowed us to see what life is like without God. And as I read that and as I thought through that, I began to look at our own world and our own life and our own country and our own situation and wonder, is some of what we've experienced because we've moved away from God, and God has allowed us to see what life looks like when we're away from him. At least for Isaiah, that was what he saw. And he said the way he described it, he says, it's dark, it's distressing, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better. I mean, he wants to be hopeful, he wants to be encouraging, but the reality is, he says, no, it's not good. When we look around the world, it's not in a good place. He continues, and then here comes the promise. Chapter 9, verse 1. He says it this way, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and we'll talk about that if you don't know what that is. But in the future, he is talking about God. God will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea and beyond the Jordan. So what is he talking about here? Okay, he's talking about this part of the nation of Israel called the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. And I was privileged to go there in about 2013. I was able to go and visit this area. If you were to look at a map and you see the nation of Israel on the map, there's a Sea of Galilee, and right north of that is part of the nation of Israel. At least it was in Isaiah's day. And this land of Zebulun and Naphtali is absolutely beautiful. It is stunning. I mean, it is a massive agricultural place. It is a great place to grow crops, to take care of your, if you're a shepherd, to feed your flocks, all these other kinds of things. It's a phenomenal place to live. The weather is good. The soil is good. I mean, it is a great, beautiful place. but because it was such a great place to live, a lot of people wanted to live there. It also just so happens, again, if you look at a map, it so happens to be the land bridge between 3 different continents. Africa, Europe, and Asia can all be accessed right through here. And it became an important economic place because so much trade passed through here. But because it was a great place to live, and because it had a great economy, you can imagine what happened. A lot of people looked at it and said, well, we want that land. We want to live there. We want that for our people. As a matter of fact, for Isaiah, almost every time his nation was invaded, it came from this northern region. They just stormed through there, killing people, burning villages, taking things. It was a tough place to live, even though it was a beautiful place to live. And even though they had all kinds of economic advantages, it felt like most of the time things were out of control. And again, I look at our world and I look at this year and I wonder, is that kind of similar to us? It's a great place to live. There's all kinds of economic advantages, but there's also a lot of difficulty, a lot of danger, and a lot of risk, and a lot of things that are not in our control. And so Isaiah comes along and he tells them, listen, yes, the darkness is real, but it isn't the only reality. It has been dark, and it looks like it's not going to get any better, but you have to understand, yes, the darkness is real. Yes, the difficulty is there, but that's not the only reality. There's more going on here. Look at verse 2. It says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And just to kind of put this into to today's terms, it's like sleeping in a pitch black room and somebody walks in and turns the light on, right? It's like, oh, it just kind of overwhelms you at first. And he's saying what God is about to do is going to be so attention-getting, so overwhelming that it feels like somebody just shines a bright light in your face, which is good to have the light so you don't step on the Lego or trip over the table or do all the things. But it takes a minute, and it's unmistakable. It just kind of knocks you back, and Isaiah says, God's getting ready to do something that's going to be unmistakable, that's going to knock people back. And it's going to be a good thing, but at the beginning, in the middle of it, it might seem a little bit overwhelming. Look at verse 3. He says, he's talking about God, you, God, have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. As they rejoice before you, as people rejoiced at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning. It will be fuel for the fire. Now, there's a lot going on here. And I just kind of put it in terms that at least help me get a hold of it. Isaiah is talking about something that God is going to do. But if you're an English person, you'll get this. He talks about it in the past tense. He says it's if it's already been done. He's so confident in what God has promised that he says, you know what? You can actually count on it already being done. No, we don't know what day we're going to see it, but God has promised it, so it's as good as done. He says, all the things that have been causing you problems, all the difficulties, all the struggles, all these things, I'm promising you, God is going to deal with this. God has taken care of this, and he's so confident, he talks about it like it's already happened, even though it hadn't happened yet, which is pretty amazing. And I got to think about, what are some famous promises? Some famous promises that somebody kept. And I love World War II stuff. And so the first one that jumped to my mind, and some of you probably know this story from history, was General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was actually stationed in the Philippines at the outbreak of World War II. He was the highest ranking U.S. Army officer in the whole Pacific region. His job was to protect the Filipino people and to protect the U.S. base and the U.S. presence there in the Pacific. Well, not long after Pearl Harbor happened, when the Japanese attacked Hawaii, they also attacked the Philippines. And it didn't take long. They actually pushed MacArthur and his army all across the islands, and finally off the island, he had to retreat. But as he was leaving, he made a promise to the Filipino people. He says, I shall return. And he goes and he retreats, and then the war drags on. And again, if you know history, you know that the war was a long, drawn-out process, several years. And so it took about 3 years before MacArthur had actually fought his way back towards a place where he could get to the Philippines. And a lot of people questioned his strategy. They said, we don't need to invade the Philippines. We can go straight on to Japan. We can win the war. We can end it. We don't have to go to the Philippines. And he insisted. He said, no, we're going to go back to the Philippines. And he does. He invades the Philippines. And he not only wins, he kicks the Japanese out. And like I said, a lot of people debate, did you really need to do that or not? But MacArthur said, I made a promise. And the Filipino people remember MacArthur as somebody who made and kept his promise. And it saved their lives, even at the cost of other lives. So people do keep promises. And I hope that you have a lot of people in your life that keep promises, that make you feel like you can trust them and you can count on them. But even if you don't, can you count on God's promise? Well, for Isaiah, he talked about it like it was already done. He said, no, you see, there's a day that's coming that all the stuff for the fight and the grind, we're not even going to need it. We're going to burn it up. We don't need it anymore. All the difficulty, all the pain, all the struggle, all the dark stuff, all the difficult things, God's going to relieve all of that. And we are going to win. And because God said it, because God's promised it, we can count on it. We can trust it. We know it's going to happen. For Isaiah, he had to look forward to it. He talked about it like it was done, but it took 700 years before that promise was fulfilled. For us, we look back on it. 2,000 years ago at Christmas, God sent his son, and he kept his promise. And for Isaiah, he described it, and he said, here's how it's going to happen. Look at verse 6. He says it this way, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. He says that he's sending his son. How do we know? I mean, what can we look for? How do we know this promise is going to be kept? God says, I'm going to send you my son. But he's not just any son. He goes, well, what does this promise look like? What does it feel like? He says, he's a wonderful counselor. Like I said earlier, God made this promise to you. And what he's promising is, I'm sending you personally, a wonderful counselor. Someone that can help heal your soul and your heart. Somebody that can speak wisdom into your life when you need to make decisions. Somebody that can give you guidance, and somebody that's there all the time to help you move forward the right way. He's a wonderful counselor. He's an everlasting God. He's never going to leave, and he's a powerful God. He gives you strength and support. And there's an old saying, if God be for us, who could be against us? He's a mighty God. He's an everlasting Father. He's going to support you. He's going to protect you. He's going to look after you and look over you. And he's the Prince of Peace. For the anxiety that you feel, the upset that you have, the overwhelm, whatever it is you're struggling with, he's a Prince of Peace. And he was going to go on to say that he's going to expand his kingdom, which in Isaiah's day, that's what every king did, right? Get an army, get some stuff, try to get more land, take over more people, get more things. They did it by force, or they did it by economics. But he said he's going to expand his kingdom through peace, through righteousness. He doesn't have to take anyone over. He doesn't have to buy his way to do it. He's going to do it through peace. It's this amazing, amazing promise. And because we celebrate Christmas, we know it's true. But maybe you're like me. I wasn't at the manger, right? I didn't see the sheep and the shepherds. I didn't see the baby in the manger. I wasn't there. And as cool as that have been, it would have been great also to have seen Jesus teaching on the hillside and be in the crowd and listen to him talk and see him move around with his disciples. And I didn't see that either. And it would have been amazing to be in the temple and listen to him. And just the way he taught, people's jaws dropped. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. It would have been amazing to be there, to sit there and take all that in. But I didn't get to. And I'm guessing neither did you. So he made this promise of this one that's going to come. And for Isaiah, it was somebody that was coming, and it was coming 700 years later. For us, it's somebody that did come, but he came 2,000 years ago. And while we can believe the promise, for a lot of us, how do we make it real? How do we connect to that, something that happened so long ago, to what's happening today? And there's such an incredible phrase he says at the end of this promise. He says, the zeal of the Lord will accomplish this. And to me, it's such an incredible double guarantee. God made the promise, he kept the promise, but he kind of gives us this second level guarantee. Because Isaiah was Jewish, and he wrote in a language of Hebrew. And when he says zeal, if you translate that word, the exact translation of that word zeal, literal, is deep red. What does that mean? He's referring to a fire. Like if you have a fire that's burning, and you've seen this, guys are sitting around fire pits and stuff right now. You've seen this now, the coals in the middle that are bright red, the hottest part of the fire. That's the deep red. And what Isaiah is saying is, it is the intensity and the heat of God's love that will accomplish this and guarantee this. And as you think about God's love, again, there's so many metaphors in the Old Testament about what is God's love like. And in one place, it's talked about as a jealous love, that God is jealous for us. He doesn't want anything to hurt us or distract us. That God's love is an all-consuming fire, that it covers everything. It's not just a small thing or a small space. It's an overwhelming love. But God also loves like a mother. He loves like a mom that sees their child and knows that their child has failed or been flawed or there's something wrong, or there's something not going well, and that child comes back hurting and needs acceptance and needs to be included and needs to know they're safe. And God loves us like that, out of the intensity of his love. And God loves us like a father whose son is gone and says he's not going to stop and he's not going to rest until he gets his son back. That he's going to go after him and he is not going to quit and he is not going to give up because his love is that intense. And that is God's love for you. It's the deep red. It's the intensity of the fire. So if you're struggling with God's promise that seemed like a long time ago and something that you didn't get a chance to see, you can take confidence in the fact that it's the zeal of God's love that holds you. That's what I said, the promise has been kept, and the promise keeps you. And so if all these things are true, if Christmas is so simple, it's the arrival of the promise, it's the promised arrival of the one who solves the problem and gives us the fresh start that we need. If that's what Christmas is, what is our role? I mean, God did it all for us and he is for us. God's kind of done all the hard work. So what is our role? What do we do in the middle of all this? And it's actually, when you first hear it, it's going to sound simple. We rejoice. We rejoice. And that's a Christmassy word, right? We always talk about rejoicing and we rejoice at Christmas time. But it makes sense if he really did keep the promise, right? If he really kept the promise, then that means your future is guaranteed. No matter how hard today is, in the end, you're going to win. The things that are causing you pain and struggle and difficulty today, the darkness that seems to surround you at times, he's going to shine a light into it. He's going to bring relief. He's going to bring healing. Again, he's the Prince of Peace. He's the wonderful counselor. I mean, he's all of those things. You can rest in that. You can rejoice in that, which sounds good, doesn't it? I mean, it's Christmas, and again, I get it, but it sounds really good. But here's the problem. I don't rejoice all the time. I mean, do you? I mean, some of you, there's probably a few of you. You get up every morning and you're like, rejoice, raise the shades, it's a new day, you know. The rest of us, the 99 other of us, are kind of like, what's going on today, you know. But our role is to rejoice. I don't. Not every day. I wish that I did. But a lot of days, I wake up discouraged, disappointed, distracted. And most of the time, I know why. Right? I mean, sometimes it's because there's something wrong in a relationship with a family or a friend or coworker or something. Something's just wrong. It's just not right. And I wake up and I feel that frustration or I feel that, just disappointment because it's not the way it should be. And so I don't rejoice. Other days I wake up and there's somebody that's close to me that's hurting. Somebody in our church family or somebody in my family or a friend or somebody or a neighbor. I mean, one of my neighbors, he just lost his wife and he doesn't know anything about me or our church or anything else, but I hurt for him. He'd been married 40 years. He lost his wife. He's struggling. I wake up feeling discouraged about that, not rejoicing. And sometimes even over you. And I don't mean because you're doing anything wrong, but I look around, I look at our church, it's so different than it was a year ago. There's so many different things that are happening, and our world is so different than it was, and we don't know what that's going to mean and how that's going to look in so many ways. And sometimes I wake up and I feel a little discouraged about it. And so you say, well, if you feel discouraged and if things aren't going well and you have heavy hearts on different things, I mean, well, isn't it kind of hypocritical then to rejoice and pretend like everything is okay? That's not what I'm saying. You see, rejoicing is not denying the present, but is instead realizing the power of the promise that God made. It's not denying that there are difficult things in my life. It's not pretending like there's no darkness around me. It's instead realizing there is power in the promise that God made, and he kept it. And him keeping his promise is what keeps me. It reminds me of Philippians 4. Philippians 4 is a verse that a lot of people go back to. It says, rejoice in the Lord. I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, But in everything, with prayer and petition, bring your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. You see, rejoicing is not just pretending like everything is good. Rejoicing is not just putting on a good mood even though you don't feel it. Rejoicing is trusting the promise of God, and in it you find something amazing happens. When you rejoice, when you are willing to recognize that God has come near, when you are willing to bring him the things in your life that aren't working, that aren't the way you want them to be, that don't feel like they're moving in the right direction, all of a sudden you find this Prince of Peace walking alongside you that's guarding your heart. And you find this everlasting Father that gives you confidence and lets you know that he is caring for you and he is going before you. You realize that the mighty God has promised that he has your future in his hands, and that the wonderful counselor is speaking words of truth and encouragement into your heart. You see, rejoicing is really, really important. God's kept his promise, and his promise keeps you. Here's the thing. It's our choice to rejoice. I mean, we have that choice. God's not going to pull his hand back. God's not going to go back on his word. He's not going to give up the promise. But we have a choice. We have a role in this. And we get to choose to rejoice. And so as we roll into Christmas, it's only a few days away, I want to challenge you. Make these days of rejoicing. Let these be days where you reflect on the promise, where you bring him your concerns, where you let him speak to your heart. Because I guarantee it will change the way you see Christmas, but even more importantly, it'll change you. It'll change your experience of God and what he's doing in your life. It's a really big choice. It's an important choice. And I hope that you will choose to rejoice. And I think if Isaiah was here, I think he would say it this way. Why would you walk in the dark if you can live in the light? It doesn't make any sense. So choose to rejoice. Let's pray together.